In this last video about memory and meaning, let's take a look at goal relevance and how it influences the kind of information that we retain. Meaning frameworks, and this is something that we've just discussed already, imply what's important. Now, here is a study from Anderson and Pritchard in 1978 that really focuses on goal relevance of memory in creating meaning. Participants here were reading a story about two boys playing a house from the perspective either of someone who was in the market for buying a house or someone who is in the market for breaking and burglaring from a house. And I want to show you now these stories that participants read, or one story, and it goes like this. And here, just for you to note, I have noted some burglar items in blue and buyer items in green. So these are items that are appeal or are more important for either the burglar or the buyer. So it goes like this. The boys walked around inside the house. The house has 4 bedrooms. That would be important for the buyer. It also has an office, a living room, and 3 bedrooms. Again, important for the buyer. There are 3 color TVs. That would be important for the burglar. One is located in the big bedroom, important for the buyer. That has its own bathroom and shower, again, important for the buyer. Besides that TV, there is a new sound system for the burglar. In the living room, a PC, burglar, a VCR, oh, this is an old study, and a rare coin collection. And then the text kept going on like this, where some items were more relevant for the buyer than for the burglar and the other way around. And directly after reading, participants were given a memory task. So they were asked to recall items or pieces of information from that story. And as you remember, they were told to read the story either from the perspective of a potential home buyer or from the perspective of a burglar. So now we can take a look at the proportion of home buyer items recalled from the perspective of being a home buyer and from the perspective of being a burglar. So this is on the left 2 bars, from the items that relate to the home buyer the most. Here were recalled more often when people were in the role of the home buyer. So congruent with the goal of buying a home, information that would be more important for a home buyer was recalled better than information that would have been more important for a burglar. And information that's important for a burglar, this is then on the right-hand side, was recalled differently again between the 2 conditions. So there was a higher retention rate for burglary-related items if participants read the story or viewed the story through the perspective of the burglar as opposed to the home buyer. So this is the first result in the study, whether your identity matched the specific items determined how likely it was that people would be able to recall them. And after this recollection task, then there was a diversion. Try to imagine the other role. And then again, the memory task. And now we can take a look at the changes in the proportion recalled. So did participants manage to recall more or less of a specific type of item in the second round? So now we have to condition on in which direction they made the identity switch, right? So they might have been the home buyer in the first round, and in the second round imagined the other role, the burglar. Those are the lighter green plots. And again, we have the home buyer and the burglar items. So if you can see that participants who switched from home buyer to burglar were now less likely to imagine home buyer items, and this would be here. They were less likely to be able to recall home buyer items, and more likely to recall burglar items, which fit the second identity they were taking on. So stuff from the first identity was forgotten, and stuff from the second identity became more important. And then the burglar turned home buyer, so the other way of switching identities from originally thinking of this story in terms of a burglar to now thinking of it in terms of a home buyer. These are the dark green lines, so this and that one. And you can see here that people who had originally thought about the burglary items, they recalled them less now in the second round, now that they had the home buyer identity. And instead recalled more items that were in line with the home buyer identity that they now had. So we see the reverse picture. And what we see all in all is that information from the first identity was forgotten, and additional information from the second, the new identity, was recalled. So this goes to show that what we do remember actually depends a whole lot on our assignment of relevance to the information that we're thinking about. Now, finally, I'd like to introduce you to hindsight bias and how it plays a role for memory. So the hindsight bias is often also referred to as the "I knew it all along" effect, and I bet you've had that feeling quite a bunch already during these videos. But here it goes to try to explain it. So if I asked you to estimate the length of the River Rhine, and I promptly told you that it was 1,232.7 kilometers, you would probably say, well, I guessed it was something in that ballpark. So the hindsight bias describes how we can project new knowledge into the past, and this goes unaccompanied by awareness of how that knowledge affects our judgment. So we think of information about the past as if we had the knowledge of today, and we're not aware that we're doing this. You could also say the tendency to see previous errors as worse in the light of new knowledge actually fits into the hindsight bias. So kind of the thought of, how could I ever been that stupid? How could I have ever made that mistake? It was so obvious that this would happen. That kind of thinking, it matches well with hindsight bias. Let's take a look at an experiment that deals with hindsight bias. This is Frischhoff in 1975. In this experiment, participants were given a text about the war between the British Empire and the Gurkhas, that's a Nepalese people, which occurred in 1814. And here are 5 conditions that participants were randomly allocated to. Either they were told that the British won the war, or they were told that the Gurkhas won the war, or they were told there was a stalemate with a peace agreement, or they were told there was a stalemate without a peace agreement, or finally there was a control group and there was just no information given about the outcome of this war. Our dependent variable in this experiment: what do participants think is the a priori probability for each possible outcome? So what did they think, how probable was it to begin with that the war would end the way it did? And of course you would now think, well, this should be independent of the conditions that participants were assigned to, because a priori you don't know what the war is going to be like in the end. So you should have before it even happened, you should have a pretty, a neutral, or at least an opinion that is unaffected by what you were later told. So if you were to think about it and form a perspective, this would be kind of the rational expectation. But perhaps you want to pause this video and make a conjecture about what you think was the actual behavior that participants displayed in this study. Now, if you thought a little bit about it, let's take a look next at what the data actually showed. So here, pretty complex graph. Let's take a second to take it apart. So we have the probability ratings, the a priori probability for each of the outcomes. So the British victory, that's on the leftmost bracket, the Gurkha victory, second bracket, the stalemate without settlement, third bracket, and the rightmost bracket, stalemate with a peace settlement. And then within these brackets, again, we have the data split up by our 5 conditions. In blue, that's the control condition. In green, that's the condition where participants were told that the British had actually won. In red, that's the condition where participants told that the Gurkhas had actually won. In purple, this is the condition where participants were told that there was a stalemate without a peace settlement. And in orange, stalemate with a peace settlement. So now, what do we see? First of all, let's take a look at the control condition, because this gives us kind of like a base rate of what people, how likely people thought that each of these outcomes were. And they thought that most likely in the control condition where either there would be a British victory or a stalemate without a peace settlement. And this was followed by a Gurkha victory, and the least likely was that participants thought there was a stalemate with a peace settlement. And now let's take a look at the peaks in the data, I would say. That's probably the easiest way to go about this. You can see that the peaks, or the color of the bars of the peaks, always match the conditions, right? So participants who were in the British victory condition, who were told that the British had won the war, those were the participants who said that it was the most likely that the British would actually win the war. And from all of the other conditions, the estimates of the likelihood of this event were lower. This is the leftmost bracket. And the second bracket, the Gurkha victory, was rated with the highest probability when participants were told that the Gurkha had won the war. In the stalemate, no settlement condition, again, we have the highest rating for, sorry, not condition, but for rating how likely it was that the stalemate without a peace agreement would happen. We have the highest rating from participants in the condition where they were told that this is how actually the war had ended. And rightmost bracket, about estimates how likely it was that there would have been a stalemate without a peace settlement. This potential outcome received the highest likelihood ratings from participants who were in the condition of being told that this was indeed how the war had ended. So we can see a perfect match between what participants were told had actually happened and what they thought was the a priori probability that this is how it would actually go. So before the war had started, they would still say it was the most likely that the event that had actually happened would happen. So basically, it's a complicated way of saying they knew it all along. You've probably had the feeling that you've known it all along with a bunch of things that deal with research, but now you know that there's a thing called hindsight bias. Perhaps that puts into perspective what you think about some of the research that we talk about. So this was it for this second installment of the social cognition lecture, where we spoke about memory in depth. And we spoke about how memory is, how memory is organized, how information is organized in memory, and how memory is affected by our social and more general by our environment, by the way that we think, how we need memory to create meaning, and how our meaning creates different memory outcomes. So we covered a whole lot of ground in terms of memory, starting from expectations to logical reconstructions, source monitoring. We talked a lot about framing, and this is of course a primarily social aspect, because how someone asks you about something that you've witnessed, well, it's probably a person asking you. We talked about false memory reconstruction. We talked about the fact that memory and remembering can be tainted by goal, relevance, and now we've spoken about hindsight bias. I would encourage you to take a moment after each video, or in particular after this video, to think back of how you can take these specific facets of the relation of memory and meaning that we've discussed about and try to apply them to very, very specifically social settings. So this is something that I haven't done a whole lot during these videos, but I think it would be an interesting exercise for you to do it. So now that we've spoken about the basic ideas of how memory and meaning are related in our social cognition literature, take a moment to yourself apply all these different interesting findings that I've showed you to social settings. So for instance, in the hindsight bias example, you could say that if a person behaved badly and you've realized that now they're a bad person, you might say, well, I could have known it all along. I should have known it all along. I did know it all along. This person has always been bad, even though they only did something bad once. So, like I said, I encourage you to take some time to find applications of all of these different facets to very, very social types of situations. As a takeaway from this lecture, I would like to point you to this idea again. So I think the most important takeaway is that our memory is not necessarily an accurate reflection of our past, meaning that we don't really replay events as they happen, but we reconstruct them. And in this process of reconstruction, of course, social things can have a huge influence. So this is why memory is an integral part of social cognition.